Hi there, and welcome to this video on GCSE Biology for the AQA specification, focusing on the human nervous system, and in particular on its structure and function. I'm Shumina from StudyMind, where we help you revise GCSE Biology with our helpful video tutorials, tailored to your subject, your specification, and to you. If you're new here, make sure you click the subscribe button. Whilst you are watching, please leave any comments below if you're unsure about anything, and let us know if it's your first time watching our videos so we can send you our free revision materials. We also have helpful timestamps below for each part of the video to help guide you through the specification. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to tutorial 1 of 4, in which we'll be looking at the structure and function of the human nervous system. So these are the topics that we'll be covering in these sets, in this set of tutorials. And we're just going to start off with the basics of the nervous system, so just looking at its basic structure and how this correlates with its function. So, first of all, let's just contrast two systems of the body. So we have the nervous system and the hormonal system. So nerve impulses create very short-term effects, whereas hormonal communication can often create more long-term chronic effects. Another difference is that the nervous system creates very fast responses, whereas the hormonal system contributes to a slower, gradually building response. So the nervous system communicates via electrical impulses via neurons, whereas the hormonal system uses chemical messengers that are secreted from glands, for example, and then travel around the body towards target organs via the blood. So nervous impulses tend to target a specific region because the nerve travels directly to the region of the body that it's targeting. Whereas because the hormonal system uses the blood to get hormones around the body, these hormones can essentially target any organ around the body, and therefore often hormonal responses have an impact on the body that's a lot more holistic compared to the nervous system. So the nervous system can also be either voluntary or involuntary. So, for example, you may reach across now to pause the video, and this is a voluntary action. Or perhaps I may tap your patellar tendon on your knee, and your knee will perform a knee jerk reflex, which we'll be looking at a little later in this tutorial, and that's an involuntary response. But with the hormonal system, we can't control our hormones, and therefore it's always involuntary. So these are the key differences between the nervous and the hormonal system. So do learn these and do understand the differences, because this could be worth a couple of marks in your exam, and they are essentially easy marks. So the nervous system is pivotal in homeostasis. And remember that homeostasis is all about keeping a constant internal environment in your body. So it helps humans react to surroundings and coordinate their behaviour. So for example, if it's too hot, the receptors on the skin recognise this and they send impulses through the nervous system to the brain, and we can then create a response. See? In contrast, the endocrine system, so the hormonal system, is the involuntary system, but they can work together, these two systems. So there is teamwork between them. So for example, nervous impulses may activate an effector gland, which will then release hormones. So let's take a closer look at the structure of the nervous system. So it's formed into two parts. We have our central nervous system, which is formed of the brain and the spinal cord. And then we have our peripheral nervous system, which transmits impulses from the central nervous system to the periphery, and also impulses from the periphery to the central nervous system. So these are your two parts to your nervous system, your central and your peripheral nervous system. And you'll often see them abbreviated to CNS for central nervous system, and this would be your PNS, your peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is made up of the nerves that send impulses to and away from the CNS. So how does the nervous system send information around the body? Well, it transmits its information via nerve impulses, which pass along cells called neurons. So the basic structural unit of the nervous system is the neuron, which is basically a nerve cell. So neuron and nerve cell can be used interchangeably, but they mean the same thing. And in fact, many neurons make up a nerve. So, for example, the ulnar nerve in the arm is made up of many bundles of neurons. So these multiple bundles of neurons make up a nerve. And this is often a point of confusion, so what the difference is between nerves, neurons and nerve cells, but I think I've made this quite clear here. So a nerve cell and a neuron is the same thing, and you can use those words interchangeably, but we like to use the word neuron because that's more scientific. And nerves are made up of bundles of neurons. So let's take a closer look at the arc that is involved in the transmittance of these signals. So we're going to focus on three types of neuron. So our sensory neuron is here, our relay neuron here, and our motor neuron. So sensory neurons are the first in the circuit, and they send impulses from a receptor in the periphery, so this might be a receptor in your finger, for example, to the CNS. And remember, the CNS includes the brain and the spinal cord. So just remember that. So this is your spinal cord here. This kind of section here. And so sensory neurons transmit information from your receptor in your finger, for example, to your spinal cord, where the sensory neuron synapses, and we'll be looking at what that means later on, but basically what that means is it makes a contact with the relay neuron, and the relay neuron forms a link between the sensory and motor neuron. And then the third neuron comes off, and this is the motor neuron, and this transmits impulses from the CNS to the effector organ. And so this effector organ will either be a muscle or a gland. So I'll give you an example of this, of how this may work. So a receptor in your finger will sense when you touch a hot pan, for example, and it will send an impulse up the sensory neuron to the CNS, so the spinal cord, where it synapses with a relay neuron, which synapses with a motor neuron, and transmits an effector signal back to your finger or back to your arm, where it will then stimulate a muscle to contract and move your finger away from danger, and therefore you don't burn your finger. So let's take a closer look into the structure of a neuron. So these are the various points that I want you to focus on. So notice that you have a long axon, which is this part in the middle here. The axon is coated by a fatty structure called the myelin sheath, which acts to insulate the neuron as it transmits nerve impulses. We have these long structures that protrude from the nerve cell, the neuron, called dendrites. And there's also a cell body which contains the nucleus of the neuron. Because remember, a neuron is a nerve cell, it's a cell, so it's got to have a nucleus. So let's take a look at this in more detail. So axons carry information across the body, and the myelin sheath, which we saw was the yellow structure covering the nerve, are the insulating layers of fat, and they basically prevent your electrical impulse from escaping from your nerve cell, because we want the electrical impulse to be transmitted. If I just go back to the diagram, we want the electrical impulse to be transmitted all the way down the cell. We don't want the electrical impulse to be lost to the environment. We don't want that. So that's what our myelin sheath is protecting us from.
So it insulates the neuron, therefore allowing for efficient transmission of the electrical impulse down the nerve, down the axon. So the cell body has the nucleus and lots of dendrons and dendrites extending from it. And the dendrites are the shorter ends of the dendrons, so the dendrons lead on to the dendrites, and they receive information from other neurons. And synapses are the points in between each neuron where electrical impulses cross. So let's look at this in a little more detail. So axons use neurotransmitters to conduct impulses across the synapse, because what we have here is we have our first neuron coming in, and it doesn't make direct contact with the second neuron, but it needs to transmit the electrical impulse that is passing down this first neuron and start the impulse again in this second neuron. But how does it do that? So this is where our synapse comes in. So an impulse has arrived at the first axon and the synapse. This impulse is going to trigger the release of neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. And the synaptic cleft is basically this gap, this synaptic gap, which is in between your first and your second neuron. So you have your impulse coming down your first neuron. It's going to stimulate release of these neurotransmitters here in this cleft. And the neurotransmitters are going to travel within the cleft and bind to the second axon. And when they bind to the second axon, they trigger an electric impulse in this second axon. And therefore, the electric impulse is able to be transmitted from this first neuron into this second neuron. So let's just look at this in a more diagrammatic way. So first of all, we have our electrical impulse, which has come, if I draw that, the electric impulse has come down from this first neuron, and it has arrived at the synapse, so this area here is meant to be the synapse, and it's going to trigger release of neurotransmitter into the synapse. So look at how the neurotransmitter was stored in these vesicles in the first neuron, and it's going to be released into the synaptic cleft because the electrical impulse in the first neuron has reached the end of the neuron. And these neurotransmitters then travel across the synaptic cleft and they bind to receptors in the second neuron, which is on the other side of the synaptic cleft. And this is going to stimulate an impulse in the second axon. So this occurs via movement of ions, which you don't need to know about at the moment. So this neurotransmitter binding to a receptor on the second neuron is going to stimulate an impulse being created in the second axon. So these diagrams are really, really helpful. So perhaps if you go back to this slide and maybe annotate it onto this in your own notes, I think that would be really useful. So now let's take a look into reflexes. So reflexes differ from actions that we voluntarily carry out because they are automatic and rapid, and they don't involve the conscious part of the brain. So this means because they don't involve the conscious part of the brain, they're going to be much more rapid and automatic than voluntary movements that we carry out. And reflexes are generally conserved within humans, so they tend to be the same within everyone. So let's take a closer look into the reflex arc pathway. So first of all, we have a stimulus that's picked up by a receptor, and earlier on in this tutorial I used the example of you touching a hot pan. So the receptor might be in your finger, for example, somewhere in your arm, and it has detected a hot stimulus. And this will cause an impulse to be started in a sensory neuron and transmitted to the CNS. Now remember, the CNS includes the brain and the spinal cord, but because this is a reflex arc, we're not going to have the impulse travelling up to the brain. Instead, it just runs through the spinal cord. So it runs through a relay neuron in the spinal cord, which then transmits the signal to a motor neuron, which is then going to transmit the impulse away from the CNS to an effector, which causes a protective response against the stimulus. So in this case, it would be moving your finger away from the heat. So this guy's put his finger into a candle, and that's going to be hot, and so he's going to have a reflex arc that's going to involve the impulse travelling through the sensory neuron to the CNS, so through the spinal cord and back through, so then it will synapse with a relay neuron. The electrical impulse will then be transmitted to a motor neuron, again via a synapse, and it's going to travel back down to the effector, which will then, in this case, is a muscle, because we've got to move our finger away from the heat source, and this will contract and therefore cause the man to move his finger away out of the candle. But remember, effectors can be muscles or glands. And in the case of a gland, this might cause secretion of a hormone. And so that would be an example of a way in which the nervous system and the hormonal system interacts. So some examples of reflex arcs include the knee-jerk reflex, which I was talking about earlier. So if you tap the patellar tendon, which is found around here, if you tap the patellar tendon in your knee, which is just under your kneecap, so yeah, this kind of region here, your knee will jerk. So that's a reflex action, and you know it's a reflex action because it's not conscious. You haven't told your knee to jerk, and this is because it's not being transmitted up to the brain. It's just going via this quick loop, this quick reflex arc. And we use the example of the hot object, and that's another example of a reflex arc as well. So in your exam, don't be fazed if you see an example of a reflex that you've not come across before, because the basic principles of it will stay the same as what we've covered today. So if you just learn this reflex arc, you will be completely fine. So don't worry too much if you don't know the details of a specific example given in the exam, because that's the point. They want you to understand the principle and be able to apply it to a new setting. So for example, they might ask you a question on reflexes regarding an animal when it hears a certain sound, but it's just going to require the same process that we've just covered here. So well done for today. We covered a lot of new concepts, so do go back and rewatch and make sure that you draw down those diagrams and annotate them, because I think that will be really helpful.
Thanks for watching this free video from StudyMind. If you liked this video, make sure to subscribe to catch our newest videos by clicking below, and leave a comment on a topic you'd like a video on. Click here to watch more videos in our series for GCSE Biology, or visit our website studymind.co.uk for free past paper compilations by topic and specification.